By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
The rain in Sutherland did not so much fall as it did colonize. It was a fine grey mist that crept into the bones, turned the peat bogs into treacherous sponges, and made the black waters of Lochdubh look like a pot of cold, forgotten tea. P.C. Hamish Macbeth, a man whose ambition was a dormant volcano that many suspected was actually extinct, stood by the banks of the River Annax with a look of profound concentration. To a casual observer, the tall, thin policeman with the shock of unruly red hair and melancholy hazel eyes looked like a man lost in a poetic trance, perhaps contemplating the majesty of the craggy peaks of Culmare. In reality, Hamish was wondering if the large Atlantic salmon hovering near the submerged rock was stupid enough to mistake a bit of illicitly tied colourful fluff for a snack. "Steady now, Lugs," Hamish whispered to the ugly, tufty-eared dog sitting patiently by his side. Lugs gave a low whine. He was as much a poacher as his master, and he knew that a splash now would mean a dinner of dry biscuits instead of rich pink fish. The peace of the morning, that glorious productive silence that comes from avoiding one's official duties, was shattered by the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine. The sound echoed off the mountainside, a mechanical intrusion that set Hamish's teeth on edge. Hamish sighed, lowered his rod, and began to disassemble it with the practiced speed of a man who had spent years dodging water bailiffs and the prying eyes of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. "Work, Lugs," Hamish muttered. "The devil finds work for idle hands, but the Sassenachs find work for me." By the time Hamish reached the narrow, winding road that led back into the village of Lochdubh, a gleaming, oversized silver SUV was parked crookedly across the path, blocking the way to the police station. Standing beside it was a man who looked like he had been curated by an expensive London boutique for a Highland adventure photo shoot. He wore a crisp, brand-new Barber jacket that had never seen a speck of mud, trousers with a crease sharp enough to cut cheese, and a pair of Italian leather boots that were currently being ruined by a puddle. "You there, constable!" the man shouted, waving a leather-bound map as if hailing a slow-witted cab driver. Hamish assumed his most vacant expression. He slumped his shoulders, let his jaw hang slightly open, and adopted a thick, molasses-slow Highland drawl. "Aye, sir. Can I be helping ye? You've a grand car there. Shame about the mud. It gets everywhere, so it does." The man huffed, adjusting his designer glasses. "I am Julian Vane, the new owner of Gorse Hill. I've been trying to find the local constabulary for 20 minutes. This village is a labyrinth of sheep and damp stone." Hamish knew Gorse Hill well. It was a sprawling, draughty Victorian pile on the edge of the village that had sat empty for years, mostly because the locals believed it was cursed and the surveyors believed the dry rot was holding the roof up. "Gorse Hill," Hamish said slowly, as if processing the name of a distant planet. "Aye, a big house. Lots of chimneys. You'll be the one they're talking about at the post office then? The London property developer?" Vane straightened his silk cravat. "I prefer visionary, Constable. Macbeth, is it? I intend to turn that derelict heap into the Highland Sanctuary. A boutique wellness retreat for the elite. No Wi-Fi, no meat, no negativity. Just silence and kale." Hamish suppressed a shudder. A village without meat and with an abundance of wellness sounded like a circle of hell Dante had forgotten to map. "Silence is something we have a fair bit of for free, Mr. Vane," Hamish said mildly. "Though the kale might be a hard sell to the Curry family, they're more of a deep-fried Mars bar sort of people. The locals will adapt or move," Vane said dismissively. "Now, I want to report a grievance. Someone has been dumping old tractor parts on my boundary line. and the smell of peat smoke from the village is drifting into my meditation garden. It's atmospheric, yes, but it's hardly clean living. I expect you to issue some sort of ordinance." Hamish looked at the man's soft, arrogant face. Vane was the worst kind of outsider, the kind who bought a piece of the Highlands and then immediately tried to scrape the Highlands off of it. "I'll look into it, Mr. Vane," Hamish lied with practised ease. "I'll write it right down in my wee book, just as soon as I've checked on a sensitive matter down by the loch. See that you do. I pay a great deal of tax, Macbeth. I expect more than a man in a rumpled uniform who looks like he's just crawled out of a bush." Vane climbed back into his silver beast, sprayed Hamish's trousers with a fresh layer of grit-filled water, and roared away toward the hotel. Hamish watched him go, his hazel eyes narrowing. The man was a walking invitation for a punch in the throat, which in Lochdubh meant he would likely be dead or sued within the month. "He's a prickly one, Lugs," Hamish said, patting his dog's head. "The kind of man who thinks money can buy the weather. Let's go see Mrs. Kennedy. If Vane has been in town for 2 days, she'll already know the colour of his underwear and how much he owes his ex-wife." As Hamish walked toward the village post office, the air felt heavier. The wind had shifted, coming off the Atlantic with a sharp, biting edge. He had a feeling that Mr. Julian Vane and his Highland Sanctuary were about to bring a very different kind of silence to Lochdubh, the permanent kind. The post office in Lochdubh was less a place of business and more a clearinghouse for the village's collective sins. As Hamish stepped inside, the bell gave a tinny, overworked jangle that seemed to protest the humidity. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool, peppermint humbugs, and the faint, lingering aroma of Mrs. Kennedy's morning kipper. Mrs. Kennedy herself, a woman whose spectacles seemed to magnify her judgment as much as her vision, was already leaning over the counter, her eyes gleaming with the predatory light of a seasoned gossip. "He's a nasty piece of work, that Vane," she began, not bothering with a greeting. In Lochdubh, a greeting was often considered a waste of breath when there was a scandal to be dissected. "Came in here demanding artisan stationery. I told him we had Basildon Bond or the Highland Terrier multipack, and he looked at me as if I'd offered him a used tissue. And then, Hamish, he had the gall to ask if the mail could be delivered twice a day. Twice in this weather! I told him he'd be lucky to get it once if the road at the glen floods again, which it will, because the council is as useless as a chocolate teapot." Hamish leaned against the counter, assuming his most sympathetic policeman at rest posture. "Aye, he seems a bit particular, Mrs. Kennedy. Did he say who he was expecting so much mail from?" "Lawyers, I'll wager," she sniffed. "Men like that live on paper and misery. He's already had a row with Archie MacLean about the pier, and I heard he told the minister that the church bell was acoustically aggressive." Hamish nodded slowly, his mind cataloguing the growing list of people who would happily see Julian Vane tossed into the loch with a set of heavy tire irons. He was about to ask if Vane had mentioned any visitors, when the door burst open with such force that the bell didn't just jangle, it shrieked. Archie MacLean stood in the doorway, his face the colour of a boiled lobster, and his breathing coming in ragged wet gasps. Archie was a man who usually moved with the glacial pace of a Highland summer, so his current state of cardiac arrest-adjacent panic was immediately alarming. "Hamish, you have to come," Archie wheezed, clutching the doorframe. "Up at the hill. The English fellow, he's gone and done it." "Done what, Archie?" "Bought the village and turned it into a car park?" Hamish asked, though a cold prickle of intuition was already dancing down his spine. "He's dead, Hamish. Planted like a bloody begonia." Hamish sighed, a long, weary sound of a man whose dreams of a poached salmon dinner and a warm fire were evaporating into the mist. "Lugs," he muttered to the dog, who had already pricked up his ears. "Duty calls. And it's a rude, noisy sort of duty, too." The walk up to Gorse Hill was a grim slog through the worsening rain. The silver SUV was still parked at a rakish angle. but the visionary was nowhere to be seen. Following Archie's trembling finger, Hamish navigated the meditation garden, a patch of torn-up heather and expensive imported gravel that looked entirely out of place against the rugged mountainside. There, in the centre of a circular stone arrangement that Vane had likely intended as some sort of zenith of peace, was the man himself. Julian Vane was indeed dead, and the manner of his passing was as bizarre as it was humiliating. He was positioned headfirst in a deep decorative peat trench he had commissioned for his authentic Highland therapy sessions. Only his lower half was visible, his expensive barber jacket hiked up to his armpits and those pristine Italian leather boots pointing skyward, like the masts of a sinking ship. Hamish stood at the edge of the trench, his hands deep in his pockets. He didn't rush forward, he didn't pull out a high-tech kit. He simply stood and looked. The rain pattered against Vane's soles, and the silence of the Highlands, which Vane had so arrogantly demanded, had finally been granted to him in the most absolute terms. Is he stuck?" Archie whispered, peering from behind a large granite boulder. "He's well beyond stuck, Archie," Hamish said softly. He noticed the way the mud hadn't been churned up, as if there hadn't been a struggle. He noticed a small, peculiar glint of something blue near the edge of the trench, a tiny fragment of plastic perhaps. And he noticed the smell, not just the earthy scent of peat, but something sweet and cloying. "Go down to the hotel, Archie," Hamish commanded, his voice losing its lazy drawl and taking on a sharp, authoritative edge. "Tell them to phone the station in Strathbane. Tell them to tell DCI Blair there's been a mishap at Gorse Hill. And Archie, tell him to bring his boots. It's a bit messy for city shoes." As Archie scrambled away, Hamish looked down at the upside-down developer. The peace of Lochdubh was shattered, and worse, the machinery of the Strathbane police was about to descend like a swarm of angry hornets. Hamish pulled his cap lower against the rain. He had a feeling Julian Vane's Highland Sanctuary was about to become the busiest crime scene in Sutherland, and he, Hamish Macbeth, was going to be blamed for every bit of mud that ended up on DCI Blair's carpet. The rain transitioned from a fine mist to a steady, rhythmic drumming that seemed intent on washing Gorse Hill back into the Atlantic. Hamish crouched low under the eaves of a nearby garden shed, shielding a roll-up cigarette from the wind. Lug sat beside him, his ears flattened against his skull, occasionally shaking himself and sending a spray of cold water onto Hamish's trousers. Hamish didn't mind. He was busy watching the way the water pooled around the edge of the peat trench. He noticed that the sweet smell he detected earlier wasn't fading with the rain. If anything, the moisture was drawing it out. It was a familiar scent, one that didn't belong in a peat bog or a wellness retreat. It smelled like the expensive, syrupy sherry the minister's wife served on Sundays, the kind that could strip the varnish off a dresser. His contemplation was violently interrupted by the scream of sirens echoing through the glen. It was a sound that always felt like a physical assault on the quietude of Lochdubh. Moments later, 3 police cars from Strathbane skidded up the muddy track, their tyres churning Julian Vane's zenith of peace into a slurry of grey silt. Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the lead car before it had even come to a full stop. He was a thick-set man with a face like an angry ham and a temperament that suggested he had spent his entire life suffering from a particularly painful pair of shoes. He was followed by the long-suffering Sergeants Anderson and Macnab, who both looked as though they would rather be anywhere else on God's green earth than standing on a Highland hillside with their boss. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice carrying over the wind like a foghorn. He stumbled as his shiny city shoes found no purchase on the slick gravel, his arms windmilling wildly before Macnab caught him by the elbow. Blair shook him off with a snarl. "Look at this place. It's a swamp. Why is it always a swamp when you're involved, you useless streak of Highland misery?" Hamish stood up slowly, putting on his most vacant, wide-eyed stare. He touched the brim of his damp cap, in a gesture that looked respectful, but was actually a well-honed mask of mockery. "Good morning to ye, Chief Inspector. It's a grand day for the ducks, is it no? I'm sorry about the mud. I did ask the rain to hold off until you arrived, but it seems it's no on the police payroll. Don't you get smart with me, you red-headed knacker," Blair hissed, his face turning a shade of purple that almost matched the heather. He stomped toward the trench, his breath coming in ragged puffs. He stopped at the edge, staring down at the inverted remains of Julian Vane. Good God, what happened here? Did he try to bury himself out of sheer boredom? "I couldn't say for sure, sir," Hamish said mildly, joining him at the edge. "Archie McLean found him just like that. I haven't moved a thing. I thought it best to wait for the experts from the city." Blair ignored the compliment, his eyes darting around the scene with a superficiality that made Hamish wince. "It's obvious, isn't it? Look at him. It's a drunken accident, or a prank gone wrong. These London types come up here, get filled with Highland malt, and think they're invincible. He probably stumbled, fell in, and couldn't get his leverage back. Asphyxiation by peat. Case closed. He was a wellness fellow, sir," Hamish interjected softly. "According to the talk in the village, he didn't touch the drink, just kale and meditation." Blair spun around, jabbed a thick finger into Hamish's chest. "I don't care if he lived on air and fairy dust, Macbeth. Look at the facts. Who found him? That local poacher McLean? I know his type. He probably had a row with the Sassenach over land rights and gave him a shove. It's a classic case of local resentment. I want McLean brought in for questioning immediately. We'll have a confession by tea time. Archie's a bit of a blowhard, sir, but he's no a killer," Hamish said, his voice deceptively calm. "And there's the matter of the smell." "The smell?" Blair barked, sniffing the air aggressively. "It smells like wet dirt and failure, Macbeth. It smells like your career. Anderson, MacNab, get the body out of there. And find me a phone that works. My mobile has no signal in this godforsaken wilderness. How do you people live like this?" "We listen to the silence, sir," Hamish murmured, but Blair was already stomping toward the silver SUV, shouting orders and complaining about the lack of a decent coffee shop within 50 miles. Hamish watched as Anderson and MacNab began the grim work of extracting the visionary. He saw Blair kick a decorative stone in frustration, completely oblivious to the fact that he was obliterating a set of faint, blurred footprints that didn't belong to Archie McLean. Hamish sighed and looked at Lugs. He had been officially sidelined, dismissed as a useless peasant once again. It was exactly where he wanted to be. While Blair spent the afternoon shouting at a terrified Archie McLean in the back of a police van, Hamish would be free to do some real work. He needed to find out who in Lochdubh had a taste for expensive sherry and who had been wellness enough to help Julian Vane into his final meditation. As the sounds of Blair's bellows faded into the mist behind him, Hamish felt a familiar sense of relief. Being underestimated was a tactical advantage he nurtured with the same care he gave his vegetable patch. He whistled low to Lugs, and the two of them began the descent back into the village, their figures quickly swallowed by the grey curtain of the Highland rain. To anyone watching from the windows of the cottages they passed, PC Macbeth looked like a man defeated, a simple village copper sent packing by the real police. In truth, Hamish's mind was working with the precision of a watchmaker, sorting through the scent of sherry and the arrogant, fragile life of Julian Vane. His first stop was not the station, but Patel's curry shop. In Lochdubh, Mr. Patel's establishment served as a secondary intelligence hub, particularly for the late-night activities of those who found the local hotel too public. The air inside was a heavenly contrast to the damp outside, warm, fragrant with cumin and turmeric, and blissfully free of DCI Blair. "Ah, Hamish," Mr. Patel said, wiping a counter with a cloth that had seen better days. "I hear the Sassenach has met a sticky end, or a muddy one, if the rumours are true." "News travels faster than the rain, Mr. Patel," Hamish said, leaning against the counter and looking wistfully at a tray of fresh samosas. "The chief inspector thinks it's an accident, or maybe poor Archie McLean having a go. But Archie's more likely to trip over his own feet than commit a murder in a peat trench." Mr. Patel chuckled and slid a samosa toward Hamish. "On the house, for the man who has to deal with the Strathbane circus. Vane was here, you know, 2 nights ago. He didn't want curry, said the spices were toxins for his digestive alignment. He wanted a glass of hot water and a place to make a phone call where his assistants wouldn't hear him." Hamish took a bite, the warmth of the pastry a comfort. And did he sound like a man at peace with his alignment? "He sounded like a man who was about to be found out," Patel said, dropping his voice. "He was arguing about money, serious money. He mentioned the sanctuary was a house of cards, and he was very interested in the local families, specifically who had old money and who had old secrets. He was looking for investors, but it sounded more like he was looking for victims." Hamish nodded, his eyes distant. "Did he have any visitors while he was here?" "A lady," Patel whispered, wrapped in a heavy blue mackintosh. "She didn't stay long. She left just as I was bringing him his water. He looked shaken. Not wellness retreat shaken, Hamish. Genuine, old-fashioned fear." Hamish thanked Mr. Patel and headed back into the rain, the samosa a warm weight in his stomach. He bypassed the police station and made his way to the Lochdubh Hotel. If Vane had been looking for old money, he would have found his way to the residents' lounge, where the local gentry sat like prehistoric birds, nursing drinks and guarding their pedigrees. Mrs. Curry, the hotel's manager, was behind the reception desk, her face set in its usual mask of professional disapproval. "If you're looking for the chief inspector, Hamish, he's already phoned 3 times to complain about the water pressure in his room." "I'm avoiding the chief inspector for the sake of my mental health, Mrs. Curry," Hamish said, offering her his most charming, lopsided grin. "I was wondering about Mr. Vane. He was staying here while Gorse Hill was being visioned. Did he have a particular taste for sherry? Something sweet and expensive?" Mrs. Curry's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Mr. Vane? He was a teetotaler, or so he claimed. He made a scene when I offered him a complimentary dram. But," she paused, checking to see if any guests were listening, "he did spend a lot of time with Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife. She's been trying to raise funds for the church roof, and Vane told her he'd handle the entire cost if she introduced him to some of her well-placed friends." "And did she?" "She had him over for tea and sherry 3 days in a row," Mrs. Curry sniffed. "Though why she'd waste the good Bristol cream on a man like that is beyond me. He was rude to the staff and had the manners of a mountain goat." Hamish leaned in closer. "Did you notice a blue mackintosh among the guests' coats lately, Mrs. Curry? Or perhaps one belonging to the minister's wife?" Before she could answer, the heavy oak doors of the hotel swung open, and a woman of undeniable elegance stepped in, shaking a damp umbrella. It was Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the daughter of the local colonel, and the woman who held Hamish's heart in a state of permanent, agonizing suspension. She looked at Hamish, then at the mud on his boots, and gave a small, knowing smile. "I hear you've been sidelined again, Hamish," she said, her voice like silk over gravel. "Which usually means you're the only one actually working. Would you like a cup of tea? I've just come from Gorse Hill, and I think there's something you should see before Blair's men trample it into oblivion." Hamish looked at Mrs. Curry, then at Priscilla. The mooching was yielding results, but the dark undercurrent of the village was beginning to pull. Vane hadn't been a visionary, he'd been a predator. And in Lochdubh, predators often found that the local sheep had very sharp teeth. Hamish followed Priscilla into the residents' lounge, a room that always smelled vaguely of old lavender and the repressed sighs of the elderly. It was a place where the fire was kept at a temperature that could roast a pheasant, and where the armchairs were designed to be entered, but never truly exited, Priscilla sat with a grace that made the tattered chintz look like velvet, while Hamish perched on the edge of a mahogany stool, feeling like a muddy thumbprint on a clean collar. "2 teas, please, Mrs. Curry," Priscilla called out, "and a plate of those shortbreads." "Hamish looks as though he's been living on nothing but Highland air and illicit fish." Hamish felt the familiar, uncomfortable heat rise in his chest. Priscilla was beautiful, wealthy, and possessed a mind as sharp as a gutting knife. She was everything a man like Hamish should want, and yet she was the primary reason he spent so much time pretending to be an idiot. If he showed too much initiative, if he became the hero Priscilla often seemed to want him to be, he'd be promoted to a grey office in Glasgow or Edinburgh. He would lose the mist, the loch, and the right to poach a salmon on a Tuesday morning. "You're looking at me with that I'd rather be talking to my dog expression, Hamish," Priscilla said, her eyes twinkling with a dangerous amusement. "Don't worry, Lugs is being pampered in the kitchen by the cook. Now tell me, has Blair already decided that Archie McLean is the mastermind behind a global peat bog conspiracy?" "He's working on it, Priscilla," Hamish sighed, taking a cup of tea. The warmth was a blessing, even if the social setting felt like a trap. He likes a simple answer. Archie is local, Archie is poor, and Archie was there. It fits Blair's worldview like a glove. "Well, your simple Archie isn't the one who was seen arguing with Julian Vane by the old standing stones yesterday evening," Priscilla said, leaning forward. "I was out for a walk before the rain turned into a deluge. Vane wasn't alone. He was with someone who didn't fit the wellness brand at all. A woman, Hamish. Not a local girl either. She was wearing a very expensive, very distinctive blue Macintosh, the kind you buy in Knightsbridge, not Strathbane." Hamish paused, his teacup halfway to his lips. "Mr. Patel mentioned a woman in blue. Mrs. Curry mentioned the minister's wife, but Mrs. Wellington's Macintosh is yellow and smells of wet Labrador. This blue one, did you see her face?" "Only a profile, but it was the body language that struck me," Priscilla said thoughtfully. "She wasn't a victim, she was an equal, or perhaps a superior." Vane looked as though he were trying to explain a failed investment, and she looked as though she were calculating the cost of a funeral. Hamish watched the flames in the hearth. The dark undercurrent was pulling harder now. "Vane was a con man, Priscilla. He was looking for investors in a sanctuary that was basically a ruin held together by hope and Highland damp. He was squeezing people for their secrets to get the cash, but if this woman was his partner, or someone he owed, why put him in a peat trench?" "That's the part that fascinates me," Priscilla said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The upper classes, Hamish, the people Vane was trying to court, don't usually go in for messy murders. They prefer a quiet social execution. But Vane was different. He was vulgar. He was loud. He was a Sassenach who thought he could buy the soul of the Highlands. Someone didn't just want him dead, they wanted him to look ridiculous. Putting him headfirst in his own therapy trench? That's not just murder, that's a critique." Hamish nodded slowly. Priscilla had a way of seeing the cruelty behind the manners that he often missed. He thought of the scent of sherry, the sweet, cloying smell that had lingered around the body. "Mrs. Wellington had him over for sherry. She's desperate for that church roof money. The minister is a good man, but he's as blind as a bat to his wife's ambitions." "The Wellingtons are old Lochdubh, Hamish," Priscilla cautioned. "Blair won't touch them. He'll go for the easy target every time. If you think there's a connection, you'll have to find it yourself, and you'll have to do it without getting yourself transferred to a desk in Strathbane." She reached out and briefly touched his hand, a gesture that sent a jolt of electricity through him that was far more potent than the tea. "Be careful, Hamish. People who kill for their dignity are often more dangerous than those who kill for money." Hamish stood up, his mind already drifting back to the damp village streets. He had a romantic complication he couldn't solve, and a murder mystery that was beginning to smell less like peat and more like the inside of a vestry. "I'll be careful, Priscilla. I'm too lazy to be anything else." As he stepped back out into the rain, leaving the warmth of the lounge and the impossible pull of Priscilla behind, he saw the Strathbane police van rattling toward the station with Archie McLean visible in the back window, looking like a bewildered sheep. Blair was moving fast, which meant Hamish had to move faster, but in a way that ensured no one noticed he was moving at all. The police station in Lochdubh was a small, squat building that looked more like a sturdy cottage than a bastion of the law. Normally it was a place of quiet contemplation and the occasional dispute over a wandering sheep, but today it was a hive of frantic, ill-directed activity. As Hamish pushed open the door, he was met with the smell of wet wool and the aggressive rattling of a typewriter. DCI Blair was leaned over a scarred wooden desk, his face a triumphant shade of magenta, while Archie McLean sat in the corner on a hard plastic chair, looking like a man awaiting his own execution.
"Aha!
The village idiot returns," Blair barked, slamming a hand onto the desk. "You're just in time to see how a real detective closes a case, Macbeth. While you were out mooching for biscuits, we've found the smoking gun. Or in this case, the smoking tweed." Blair held up a small evidence bag with the flourish of a magician. Inside was a jagged scrap of coarse, earth-coloured wool, found it snagged on a bramble not 10 feet from the victim's head. It's an exact match for that rag McLean is wearing. He had a row with Vane over the pier, followed him up the hill and shoved him into the muck. Open and shut. I'll have him in the cells at Strathbane before the pubs close. Hamish didn't look at the evidence bag immediately. Instead, he looked at Archie. The old man was trembling, his cap clutched in his gnarled hands. "I didn't do it, Hamish," Archie whispered, his voice cracking. "I went up there to see if I could... to see if the man had left any of his fancy London tools lying about. But he was already like that. I swear it on the bones of my ancestors." "Save it for the judge, you old goat," Blair shouted. "Macbeth, get the paperwork ready. I want the arrest report typed and signed." Hamish sighed and walked over to Archie, leaning down as if to comfort him. His eyes, however, were fixed on Archie's sleeve. "That's a grand jacket, Archie," Hamish said in his slowest, most deliberate drawl. "I mind seeing Mrs. Higgins mending a tear in it just yesterday afternoon at the post office. She was complaining about how hard it is to match that particular weave of Harris tweed." "Aye," Archie muttered. "She used a bit of thread from her own husband's old coat. A dark green it was." Hamish turned to the evidence bag on the desk. He leaned in, his nose inches from the plastic. "That's a very interesting thing, Chief Inspector. This scrap here. It's been torn for a long time. See the edges? They're frayed and weathered, and there isn't a hint of dark green thread to be seen. If Archie had torn his jacket this morning, the edges would be fresh and the wool would be bright." Blair's eyes narrowed. "It's a different tear, you fool. He probably has a dozen holes in that pathetic rag. Archie's only got the one good coat, sir," Hamish countered gently. "And there's another thing. Look at the mud on that scrap. It's dry. It's been dry for days, but it's been raining in Lochdubh since Tuesday. If that scrap came off Archie this morning at the scene, it would be as sodden and black as the peat in that trench." Blair snatched the bag back, his face twitching. "It's a minor detail. The forensics will sort it out. And there's the matter of the boots," Hamish added, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "You said the prints up there were Archie's, but I saw those prints, sir. They were deep and clear in the gravel. Archie here has a limp in his left leg from the time he fell off the old bridge. His left footprint is always lighter and slightly turned out. The prints at Gorse Hill were perfectly symmetrical. Whoever stood by that trench had two very strong, very healthy legs." Blair looked from Hamish to Archie, then back to the evidence bag. The silence in the room became heavy, broken only by the rain drumming on the roof. The chief inspector knew Hamish was right, and that realization was clearly causing him physical pain. He couldn't arrest Archie now without looking like a complete amateur when the case reached the fiscal. "Fine," Blair spat, throwing the bag onto the desk. "So McLean is a lucky old drunk. But that doesn't change the fact that Vane was murdered by a local. If it wasn't him, it was someone else with a grudge. I want a list of every able-bodied man in this village who had a reason to hate that London prick." "I'll get right on that, sir," Hamish said, stepping back into his role as the lazy subordinate. "But if you'll excuse me, I think I left my official notebook back at the hotel. I should go and retrieve it before someone spills tea on it." As he stepped out of the station, the cool air felt clean after the oppressive heat of Blair's temper. He had saved Archie, but the mystery had only deepened. The scrap of tweed had been a plant, a deliberate attempt to frame the village's most obvious suspect. That meant the killer wasn't just impulsive, they were calculating, and they knew exactly how the police, especially someone like Blair, would react. Hamish pulled a small, blue glinting object from his own pocket. He had picked it up from the edge of the trench when Blair wasn't looking. It wasn't a piece of plastic. It was a small, sapphire-encrusted cufflink shaped like a tiny, elegant fish. It was expensive, it was distinctive, and it certainly didn't belong to Archie McLean. The hidden motive was beginning to surface, and it wasn't about land or wellness. It was about something far older and much more dangerous. Hamish whistled for lugs, his hazel eyes sharp with a new, grim focus. He needed to find the other fish. The sapphire fish cufflink sat in the palm of Hamish's hand, feeling cold and suspiciously heavy. It was a beautiful piece of jewellery, the kind that whispered of London auctions and old inherited wealth, entirely out of place in a village where the most expensive thing most men owned was a reliable tractor or a sturdy pair of galoshes. Hamish turned it over, noting the initials JV engraved on the back. It had belonged to the victim, but it hadn't fallen out by accident. It had been pulled. The silver link was twisted, a silent testament to a final, desperate grasp. Hamish whistled softly, a low, mournful sound that lugs mirrored with a huff. He didn't head back to the hotel or the station. Instead, he turned his steps toward the manse. If the Sassenach had been spending his afternoons drinking Bristol cream with Mrs. Wellington, then the manse was the place where the gossip of the gentry was distilled into its purest, most volatile form. The manse was a tall, dour building that seemed to be trying to hide behind a screen of overgrown rhododendrons. As Hamish approached, the front door opened, and Mrs. Wellington herself stepped out, carrying a basket of damp laundry. She was a formidable woman, built like a Highland fortress, and possessing a voice that could crack a stained glass window at 50 paces. "Hamish Macbeth, have you come to tell me that dreadful man Blair has finally arrested someone?" she barked, though her eyes were restless, darting toward the road. "The village is in an uproar. My husband has had to take to his bed with a migraine. The stress of having a murder so close to the vestry is quite unbalancing." "I'm sorry to hear about the minister's head, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, slipping into his most humble, apologetic tone. "It's a terrible business. I was just wondering if I could trouble you for a quick word about Mr. Vane. The chief inspector is very interested in his spiritual interests." Mrs. Wellington's face softened slightly at the mention of her influence. "He was a seeker, Hamish. A bit loud, perhaps, and terribly misguided about his diet, but he was prepared to be very generous to the roof fund. He understood that the church is the heart of the community." "Aye, a generous man," Hamish agreed, following her into the kitchen. He noticed a blue mackintosh, the very one Priscilla had described, dripping over the back of a chair by the Aga. It wasn't the yellow one she usually wore. "That's a grand coat, Mrs. Wellington. Very stylish. It looks like something from the big city." "It was a gift," she said shortly, turning her back to fill a kettle. "From Mr. Vane. He said it was a token of appreciation for my help in navigating the local social waters. He felt a man in his position needed an advocate. Hamish leaned against the warm surface of the Aga, his eyes wandering to the small writing desk in the corner. Among the parish newsletters and bills was a small leather-bound ledger. Advocacy is a thirsty business. I don't suppose you have a drop of that sherry left? The rain has gotten right into my marrow. As Mrs. Wellington moved to the cupboard, Hamish took a quick, silent step toward the desk. He didn't open the ledger, but he saw the top page. It wasn't a list of donors. It was a list of names, local names with dates beside them. Some of the dates went back 40 years. Beside the names were figures, but not in pounds. They were notes: the McLean land dispute, 1984, the Colonel's silent partner, the Brodie inheritance. It wasn't a wellness retreat Vane had been building. It was a blackmail empire. He hadn't come to Lochdubh for the air, he had come for the archives. He had used his charm and his generosity to get Mrs. Wellington to open the church records and the village memories, looking for the rot beneath the respectable Highland surface. "Here," Mrs. Wellington said, pressing a glass into his hand. Her fingers were trembling. "Drink it and go, Hamish. I have to look after the minister." Hamish took a sip of the sherry. It was sweet, syrupy, and exactly what he had smelled at the crime scene. But as he looked at Mrs. Wellington, he saw something more than greed or ambition. He saw a deep, abiding shame. "You didn't kill him, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said softly, the Highland drawl vanishing. "You're too fond of your own position to risk a peat trench. But you helped him, didn't you? You gave him the ammunition, and then you realised he wasn't just going after the outsiders. He was going after everyone, even the people who thought they were his friends." Mrs. Wellington sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the laundry basket forgotten. "He was a devil, Hamish. He made it sound so noble. He said he wanted to right the wrongs of the past, but he just wanted to own us. He had something on everyone. He even found out about—" She trailed off, her face turning a ghastly shade of grey. "About what? About the help the village provided during the war," she whispered. "Something that would have shamed the Halberton Smythes and the Wellingtons alike. He was going to publish it in his Sanctuary prospectus as a history of the land. It would have ruined us." Hamish understood now. The motive wasn't money, it was the preservation of a myth. The killer hadn't just wanted Vane dead, they'd wanted to bury the truth along with him. And the head-first position? It was a final, mocking wellness pose. A petty, human act of revenge for a man who had tried to play God with their secrets. "I have to go, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, putting the glass down. "But I'd keep that blue coat out of sight if I were you. It's a very distinctive shade of guilty." He stepped out into the rain, his mind spinning. He knew the motive, and he knew the blue woman was the accomplice, even if she wasn't the executioner. But who had the strength to upend a man into a trench, and who had been helpful enough to be invisible? He looked toward the village schoolhouse, where the lights were still burning. He needed to talk to someone who knew the history Vane had been so keen to exploit. The schoolhouse was a beacon of light against the encroaching dark of the glen, its windows glowing with a steady, studious warmth. Inside, Elspeth Grant was marking papers with a red pen that looked like it was drawing blood from the essays of Lochdubh's less inspired youth. She looked up as Hamish and Luggs entered, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles with a sharp intelligence that Hamish both admired and feared. "You look like a drowned rat, Hamish," she said, not unkindly, pushing a stack of papers aside. "And if you've come for a history lesson on the Highland clearances to bore your chief inspector with, you're too late. The library is closed, and I've had quite enough of men in uniforms for one day." Hamish sat down on a tiny wooden chair meant for a 7-year-old, his wet coat dripping onto the linoleum with a rhythmic plip-plop. "Not the clearances, Elspeth. The 1940s. a time of patriotic smuggling and certain families making sure they stayed rich while others went to the front. Julian Vane found something in the church archives, something he was using as a lever. Mrs. Wellington was helping him, thinking she was protecting the church, but she was just opening the door for a blackmailer. Elspeth's pen paused. The dry, sceptical humour in her eyes was replaced by a grim recognition. Vane was digging into the Lochdubh handshake then. It's an old story, Hamish. A group of local families who redirected government supplies and took a healthy cut for their silence. My grandfather always said the wealth of the big houses didn't all come from sheep and sermons. But Vane was an amateur. He didn't realise that in the Highlands, the past isn't just a story, it's a property line. You don't cross it unless you're prepared to be buried under it. Hamish nodded, his gaze fixed on a map of Scotland on the wall. He had all the pieces now, the motive of shame, the accomplice in blue, and the visionary who had overestimated his own cleverness. He just needed the player to move. I have the cufflink he lost in the struggle, Elspeth, the one with the sapphire fish, and I think I know where he kept his prospectus, the ledger of all those old sins. If I were to tell the village that I'd found the second cufflink and the book, do you think the owner would come calling? They'd have to, Elspeth said, her voice dropping. That ledger is a death warrant for a dozen reputations in this county. But you're putting yourself in the path of someone who has already proven they have the stomach for a very messy murder. Are you sure you're lazy enough to handle that? I'm too lazy to do a proper investigation twice, Hamish muttered, standing up and whistling for lugs. His next stop was the hotel bar. It was the hour when the village gathered to wash away the damp of the day with whiskey and gossip. The room was crowded with locals and Blair's weary officers, who were nursing half-pints and complaining about the lack of central heating. Hamish walked straight to the counter, ignoring the glares from the Strathbane men. He pulled a small, heavy-looking envelope from his pocket. Inside was nothing but a stack of blank parish newsletters and a shiny bit of brass he'd found in a kitchen drawer. "Mrs. Curry," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the clink of glasses and the low hum of conversation. "I'll no be having dinner tonight. I've found some sensitive materials up at Gorse Hill, the second part of that expensive jewellery Mr. Vane was wearing, and a book of names he'd been keeping. I'm going to lock them in the station safe until the chief inspector wakes up from his nap tomorrow. It's too important to leave in a hotel room." A hush fell over the bar. Out of the corner of his eye, Hamish saw a figure near the fireplace stiffen. It wasn't one of the old gentry, and it wasn't the minister's wife. It was someone younger, someone who had spent the last few weeks being helpful to everyone in the village, someone with the physical strength to upend a grown man into a trench without breaking a sweat. "Be careful, Hamish," Mrs. Curry warned, her face pale. "A man was killed for less than a book of names." "I'll be fine," Hamish said with a wide, deceptive yawn that suggested he was thinking of nothing more than his pillow. "I'm just a useless village copper, as the chief inspector says. Nobody pays any mind to me. I'll be at the station with lugs. Just me, a pot of coffee, and the evidence. Good night to ye all." He walked out into the rain, feeling the eyes of the killer burning into his back like hot coals. The trap was set. He had presented himself as the stupid policeman holding the keys to the kingdom. As he reached the station and turned the heavy iron key in the lock, he whispered to Lugs, "Tonight we see who comes out to play in the rain, laddie. Keep your ears sharp." He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the darkness of the office, the glowing ember of a roll-up cigarette the only sign of life, listening to the rain drumming on the roof and the slow, heavy ticking of the wall clock. He was waiting for the floorboard to creak, for the handle to turn, and for the hidden darkness of Lochdubh to finally step into the light. The darkness in the police station was thick enough to swallow the glow of the peat fire in the hearth, leaving only the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the wall clock to mark the passing of the hours. Hamish sat perfectly still in his high-backed chair, his long legs stretched out toward the cold grate. Lugs was a silent, warm weight against his shins, though the dog's breathing had changed from a rhythmic snore to a shallow, expectant hiss. Hamish didn't reach for his lamp. He didn't even reach for another cigarette. He simply waited, listening to the symphony of the Highland storm, the wind shrieking through the eaves and the rain lashing the glass like gravel. Around midnight the sound changed. It wasn't the wind. It was the soft, rhythmic scrape of metal against metal, the unmistakable sound of a skeleton key being introduced to the lock of the station door. Hamish felt Lugs's hackles rise. He placed a steadying hand on the dog's head, a silent command for patience. The door groaned on its hinges, admitting a swirl of mist and the sharp ozone scent of the Atlantic. A figure slipped inside, silhouetted against the grey light of the street lamp for a fraction of a second before the door clicked shut. The intruder moved with a grace that was entirely at odds with the clumsy villagers Blair so despised. This was someone young, fit, and dangerously focused. The figure moved toward the desk, their boots making no sound on the floorboards. Someone wearing soft-soled deck shoes, perhaps, or expensive trainers. As the intruder reached for the heavy envelope Hamish had left prominently on the blotter, Hamish spoke. His voice was low, devoid of its usual lazy lilt, and it cut through the darkness like a chilled blade. "It's a long walk from the hotel in this weather, Peter. I'm surprised you didn't take the silver SUV, or does the sight of it make you a bit nauseous now?" The figure froze. A beam from a powerful penlight cut through the gloom, swinging wildly until it found Hamish's face. Peter Ross, the young, athletic handyman who had been helping Julian Vane renovate Gorse Hill, stared at Hamish with eyes that were wide with a frantic cornered light. He was wearing a dark waterproof jacket, but around his neck hung a silk scarf that looked suspiciously like the pattern of the blue mackintosh Priscilla had described. "Give me the book, Macbeth," Peter hissed, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a volatile mix of adrenaline and rage. "You don't understand. That man was a parasite. He was going to destroy everything. My family, the Wellingtons, even the Colonel. He had documents, Hamish. Photos of things that happened during the war that should stay buried." "I understand better than you think, Peter," Hamish said, rising slowly from his chair. He looked remarkably tall in the shadows, his frame losing its usual slouch. "I understand that Vane was a blackmailer. I understand that he used Mrs. Wellington to get into the archives. But I also understand that you were the one who did the heavy lifting. You're the only one in the village strong enough to upend a man into a peat trench and hold him there until the bubble stopped. It wasn't just about the village, was it? Vane found out about your father's arrangements with the estate funds, didn't he?" "Shut up." Peter lunged. He didn't move like a local brawler, he moved like a man who'd been trained. He aimed a heavy blow at Hamish's head, but Hamish wasn't there. For all his talk of laziness, Hamish possessed the wiry, explosive strength of a man who spent his days climbing deer paths and wrestling stubborn rams. Hamish stepped inside the arc of the punch, his hand locking onto Peter's wrist with the strength of a gin trap. At the same moment, Luggs, seeing his master under attack, launched himself with a ferocious snarl at Peter's legs. The young man cried out, stumbling back against the desk. The heavy envelope slid to the floor, spilling its contents, a stack of worthless parish newsletters and a brass button from an old coat. "You lied," Peter gasped, staring at the paper. "You don't have it." "I have enough," Hamish said, twisting Peter's arm behind his back and forcing him down onto the floorboards with a grunt of effort. "I have the cufflink you dropped when he fought back, Peter. The sapphire fish. I imagine the other one is still in your jewellery box at home, or maybe at the bottom of the lock. And I have the scent of Mrs. Wellington's sherry on your breath from earlier this evening. She was your accomplice, wasn't she? She lured him to the zenith of peace for a final meeting, and you were waiting in the shadows." Peter struggled, his face pressed against the cold wood. "He deserved it. He was going to ruin us." "Maybe he was," Hamish muttered, reaching for his handcuffs. But Lochdubh doesn't belong to the people who kill to keep their secrets. It belongs to the people who have to live with them. The struggle was brief but exhausting. By the time Hamish had Peter secured to the heavy iron radiator, the young man had collapsed into silent, shuddering sobs. Hamish sat back on the edge of the desk, his chest heaving, and wiped a smear of blood from his lip. He looked at Lugs, who was busy licking a paw and looking quite pleased with himself. "Well, laddie," Hamish sighed, the Highland drawl returning as the adrenaline faded. "We've got the killer. Now comes the hard part. We have to make sure the Chief Inspector thinks it was all his idea, or we'll be looking at a promotion by Monday morning." The grey dawn light began to filter through the station windows, turning the shadows into a flat, uninspiring reality. Peter Ross sat slumped against the radiator, his face a mask of exhausted defeat, while Lugs snored softly by the cold hearth, the excitement of the night already forgotten in favour of a good nap. Hamish, however, was far from resting. He spent the early hours tidying the station, ensuring that the fake evidence was tucked away and that the real cufflink was placed in a prominent yet seemingly found position on the floor near the entrance. When the familiar, aggressive roar of Blair's car announced the Chief Inspector's arrival, Hamish quickly assumed his position. He slumped into his chair, ruffled his red hair until it looked like a bird's nest, and wiped a bit of soot onto his cheek to look properly distressed. The door slammed open, and Blair marched in, looking as though he had spent the night sleeping in a tumble dryer. His face was a thunderous shade of mottled red. "Macbeth, why aren't you answering the phone? I've been trying to—" Blair stopped dead, his small piggy eyes bulging as they landed on the handcuffed Peter Ross. "What in the name of God is this?" Hamish jumped up, looking startled and slightly dim-witted. "Oh, Chief Inspector, you're here. It's the most amazing thing, sir. You were right all along. It's just like you said at the hotel. You mentioned that the killer would be a strong local with an athletic build and a deep-seated grudge. Your words, sir, they stayed with me all night." Blair blinked, his chest puffing out instinctively at the mention of his own perceived brilliance. Well, yes, I did say that. I knew it wasn't that old drunk McLean." "Exactly, sir," Hamish chirped, his drawl thick enough to stand a spoon in. "I was just sitting here contemplating your theory about the athletic local when this fellow burst in. He must have heard you talking about the evidence at the bar and panicked. He came right for me, hoping to steal your brilliant case files. If it hadn't been for your tactical foresight in mentioning the suspect profile so publicly, he never would have revealed himself." Blair looked at Peter, then back at Hamish, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He didn't care about the details, he cared about the headline. DCI Blair's psychological profile traps Highland killer. He could already see the commendation on his desk in Strathbane. "And look here, sir," Hamish added, pointing to the sapphire cufflink on the floor. "He must have dropped this in the struggle. It matches the one from the victim perfectly, just as you predicted. The wealthy connections motive you were hinting at during dinner." Blair hadn't hinted at any such thing, but he nodded vigorously. Of course. Excellent work, Macbeth. In following my lead, that is. I'll take it from here. Anderson, MacNab, get this man into the car. We've got a long drive to the station, and I want a full confession before we hit the city limits." As the Strathbane officers hauled a silent, broken Peter Ross toward the cars, Blair turned back to Hamish, his eyes narrowing. "You know, Macbeth, for a moment there, I thought you were actually going to be useful. But I suppose a lucky break based on my superior deductive work is the most I can expect from a village PC." "Aye, sir," Hamish said, looking down at his boots with a humble shrug. "I'm just glad I could be a small part of your big success. I wouldn't know what to do with a promotion anyway. All that paperwork and city traffic, it would be the death of me. Don't worry about that. Blair snorted, climbing into his car. "I'll make sure the Commissioner knows I had the situation well in hand. You just get back to your sheep and your poaching. And for heaven's sake, wash your face. You look like a chimney sweep." Hamish watched the sirens fade into the distance, the blue lights flickering against the morning mist. He felt a profound sense of relief. The case was solved, the village secrets were for now kept under the surface, and Blair was leaving Lochdubh with an ego so inflated it was a wonder the car could carry him. Most importantly, Hamish was still exactly where he wanted to be. He turned back into the station and whistled for lugs. "Well, laddie, the big man has his glory, and we have our peace. I think it's time for a proper pot of coffee, and perhaps a wee bit of that bacon Mrs. Kennedy was saving for us. What do you say?" Lugs gave an enthusiastic bark and trotted toward the small kitchen area. The dark undercurrent of the Highland murder had been pushed back into the depths, and as the rain finally began to ease, the familiar quiet rhythm of Lochdubh began to return. The following morning, the sun made a rare and somewhat apologetic appearance, casting a pale, watery light over the peaks of the Strathbane. The village of Lochdubh seemed to exhale collectively, a long, weary sigh that vibrated through the damp stone cottages and the rustling heather. The sirens were gone, the silver SUV had been towed away to a police impound in Strathbane, and the Highland Sanctuary was once again just Gorse Hill, a draughty, decaying monument to a man who had tried to harvest secrets where he should have been planting potatoes. Hamish walked slowly down the main street, Lugs trotting at his heels with the satisfied air of a dog who had done his bit for the crown. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and the faint, sweet scent of peat smoke rising from the chimneys. At the post office, Mrs. Kennedy was already busy updating the window display, replacing a Keep Lochdubh Clean poster with a handwritten notice for the upcoming church jumble sale. "A sad business, Hamish," she said as he entered, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge of judgment. Peter Ross. Such a helpful boy. It just goes to show you never can tell what's brewing in a man's heart, though I always said he spent too much time in that gym in Strathbane. All that muscle and nowhere for the common sense to grow. "Aye, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish replied, leaning against the counter and accepting a small, slightly stale peppermint from the glass jar. "It's a tragedy for the Ross family. But I suppose the Chief Inspector would say it's a victory for the law." He seemed very pleased with himself when he left. Pleased? He looked like a cat that had found the key to the creamery, she sniffed. "He stopped in here to buy a pack of cigars and told me he expects to be a superintendent by the end of the month. A landmark case, he called it. The man is a walking advertisement for the benefits of a thick skull." Hamish smiled to himself. The credit had shifted exactly where it needed to go. In the eyes of the Strathbane authorities, Hamish was once again the lucky, bumbling village constable who had stumbled into a master's shadow. He was safe from the threat of a desk, safe from the smog of the city, and safe to spend his afternoons by the river without a radio crackling in his ear. As he stepped back outside, a sleek Land Rover pulled up beside him. Priscilla Halberton Smythe leaned out of the window, her dark hair catching the morning light. She looked at Hamish, then at the quiet, undisturbed loch, and then at the small dark bruise on his jaw that he hadn't quite managed to hide. "So, Blair is the hero of the hour," she said, her voice dry and knowing. "The newspapers in the city are already running stories about his intuitive grasp of the Highland psyche. I don't suppose you have anything to say about that, Hamish? The Chief Inspector is a man of great vision, Priscilla," Hamish said, his hazel eyes twinkling with a secret mirth. "Just like Mr. Vane. They both see exactly what they want to see. I'm just glad it's over. The Highlands aren't meant for that kind of noise." Priscilla reached out and touched the cuff of his sleeve, her fingers lingering for a second longer than was strictly necessary. "You kept the secrets, didn't you? The ledger, the archives, the Lochdubh handshake. You let Blair have the glory so the village could keep its dignity. Hamish looked out over the water. Dignity is a fragile thing, Priscilla. Once it's gone, you can't buy it back, not even with all the wellness retreats in London. I think Lochdubh has had enough wellness to last it a century. She laughed, a silver sound that seemed to brighten the morning. You're a terrible man, Hamish Macbeth. A lazy, poaching, brilliant, terrible man. Come up to the big house on Friday. My father is opening a bottle of the good malt to celebrate the departure of the Londoners, and I think you've earned a glass. Or 3. I'll see if I can find the time, Priscilla. Hamish lied, knowing full well he would be there even if he had to walk through a gale to do it. He watched her drive away, the dust settling on the road behind her. He felt a familiar, comfortable ache in his chest, the romantic complication that would never truly resolve, and the quiet, fierce love for the land that defined his every breath. He turned back toward his cottage, his thoughts drifting toward the pot of stew he had left simmering on the stove and the unfinished book on his bedside table. The peace of Lochdubh had been disrupted, but like the heather after a storm, it was already beginning to straighten itself. The secrets were buried again. The outsiders were gone, and the stupid policeman was back to his routine. As he reached his door, Hamish paused to look up at the towering peaks of Culmer. The mountains didn't care about blackmail or money or the ambitions of men from the city. They just stood there, ancient and indifferent, wrapped in their eternal blanket of mist. Hamish stepped inside, lugs following close behind. He closed the door against the wind, clicked the lock, and felt the immense, beautiful silence of the Highlands wrap around him like a heavy wool coat. He was home. He was safe. And for at least another day, the world was exactly as it should be. The pot of stew on the stove gave a cheerful, thick bubble, releasing the savoury scent of mutton, onions, and a handful of wild garlic Hamish had plucked from the edges of the minister's garden, while the man was distracted by his wife's sudden recovery from her nerves. It was a humble meal, one that didn't involve kale, detoxification, or the pursuit of a higher spiritual alignment. It was exactly what a man who had just saved the soul of a village required. Hamish stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, his hazel eyes fixed on the small, flickering flame. The silence of the cottage was absolute, a heavy, comforting blanket that made the events of the past few days feel like a fever dream that had finally broken. Luggs sat by the door, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the floorboards. He was waiting for his share, and he knew from experience that Hamish's investigative portions were always more generous than the ones served when the law was quiet. Hamish glanced at the small, leather-bound ledger sitting on his kitchen table. It was the real one, the collection of old sins and hidden debts that Julian Vane had planned to use as the cornerstone of his Highland empire. Mrs. Wellington had lost it during the chaos, and Blair, in his rush to claim the glory of the arrest, hadn't even known it existed. Hamish didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew the names, and he knew the stories. He knew which families had profited from the war, and which ones had built their fences on lies. To some, this book was power. To Hamish, it was just a collection of burdens. He walked over to the hearth, where the peat fire was glowing a deep, ancient red. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the ledger into the heart of the flames. The leather curled and blackened, the pages turning to ash in a matter of seconds. The Lochdubh handshake was finally dead, its secrets rising up the chimney and vanishing into the vast, cold Sutherland sky. "There now, Luggs," Hamish whispered. "No more ghosts to haunt the glen. Just us and the rain." A sharp rap on the door startled the dog, who gave a sharp, inquisitive bark. Hamish sighed, his shoulders slumping. He had hoped for at least one night of pure, unadulterated laziness before the village resumed its demands on his time. He opened the door to find Archie McLean standing there, clutching a bottle of something that smelled suspiciously like home-brewed poteen, and looking far too cheerful for a man who had nearly been arrested for murder 48 hours ago. Hamish, I heard the news. Archie beamed, pushing his way into the cottage without waiting for an invitation. Blair is all over the wireless. They say he tracked the killer through the mountains using nothing but his instinct and a compass. The man's a regular Sherlock Holmes, so he is. I thought I'd come by and see how you were taking the news of your oversight in the matter. I'm taking it very well, Archie, Hamish said, reaching for 2 mugs. The Chief Inspector is a man of many talents. Most of them involve talking to people with microphones. I'm just happy to be out of the rain. Would you like a drop of stew to go with that paint stripper you're carrying? Archie sat at the table, his eyes gleaming. I'll take the stew, and I'll take the peace. The village is quiet, Hamish, really quiet. The Gorse Hill house is locked up, and they say the visionary's lawyers are fighting over who gets to pay for the funeral. It'll be back to the sheep and the heather soon enough. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the clinking of spoons and the occasional moan of the wind in the chimney. It was the kind of silence that only exists in places where the past is long and the memories are deep. Archie eventually left, stumbling slightly into the dark, leaving Hamish alone once more with the dying fire. Hamish stepped out onto his porch for one last look at the village before bed. The lights of Lochdubh were tiny, defiant sparks against the immense blackness of the mountains. He thought of Julian Vane, a man who had come to the Highlands to find wellness and had instead found the oldest truth of the North, that the land doesn't care about your plans. He thought of Priscilla, waiting in her big house with her fine malt and her complicated smiles, and he thought of Blair, currently celebrating in a bar in Strathbane, utterly unaware that he was only a hero because a lazy policeman had decided it was the easiest way to stay home. Hamish whistled low for Lugs, and the dog followed him back inside. He clicked the light off, the darkness of the cottage merging with the darkness of the glen. He was PC Hamish Macbeth, the man who knew everything and did nothing, the smartest man in the room who never wanted to be noticed. He pulled the covers up to his chin, the smell of peat and rain lingering in the air. Tomorrow, there would be a sheep to find, a phone call to dodge, and perhaps a salmon to poach. But tonight, there was only sleep, the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who had kept the peace, and more importantly, had kept his life exactly the way he liked it. The Highland murder was over, the dark humour of it all tucked away like a sharp stone in a pocket, and Lochdubh was once again a place where the biggest scandal was the price of a pint, and the only thing truly wellness was the silence of a job well done.